Well, first of all, just thank you very much, everyone, for coming. It's really lovely to see so many familiar faces. I know some of you I know from a long time ago for coming to my other workshops from years ago. Some of you I know we chat in the Nottingham Writer Studio Facebook group, and it's just really lovely to see people that I know and people that I don't know, because hopefully you're interested in fairy tales and seeing what they can do in your writing, hopefully. So if you do have any questions, feel free to, just make a note of them now. And then, as Sophie said, we could talk about them later on. And I'm really happy to discuss anything, really. So what I'll first of all do is I'll introduce myself. And some of you know me as Teika Bellamy. My pen name is Teika Marija Smits. And the lucky thing about that is that Teika actually means fairy tale in Latvian, which is helpful, and because I write fairy tales and I edit fairy tales. And as probably most of you know, a smith is somebody who works with something, with a particular thing. So technically, I'm a fairy tale smith. So yeah, so that's a very lucky thing. So some of you know me as writing poetry as well. My first debut pamphlet is here somewhere. Some of you know me from my pamphlet, Russian Doll, which was published recently, well, in March by Indigo Dreams Publishing. And that does feature, it's not wholly on fairy tales, but it does have like sort of, it does have resonances of fairy tales with it. And I drop in little hints here and there. So obviously, if you're into poetry, you might be interested in that. But some of you also know me as somebody who used to be, I'm still an editor, but I used to publish anthologies. I used to run a small press in Nottingham from my home. And some of you will know, here they are, these wonderful books called The Forgotten and Fantastical. That was number 1, as you see, and that was number 2. And the very last one, it went all the way up to number 5. And I got the pleasure of working with very many short story writers who were interested in putting a spin on fairy tales, giving them perhaps a sci-fi edge or a magical realism edge, or setting them in a completely different universe or from a completely different perspective. So I've edited a lot of short stories in my time. So I think I've got hopefully more of a handle on kind of what works and what doesn't work with those stories, and what you can do to reinvent and repurpose fairy tales. So yeah, that's me. So I'm a writer, an editor, and I used to be a publisher and a fairy tale smith. So that's why I'm here talking about this great passion in my life, which is fairy tales. So first of all, I'm going to give you a quote from a book called Blackthorn White Rose, which is probably on one of our bookshelves somewhere here. And this is from the introduction, and it's a book that's edited by Ellen Datlow and Terry Windling, which some of you may have heard of. And they refer to fairy tales as Märchen. I think that's how you say it in German. And they say the power of Märchen and the reason they have endured in virtually every culture around the globe for centuries is due to this ability to confront unflinchingly the darkness that lies outside the front door and inside our own hearts. The old tales begin once upon a time, yet they speak to us about our own lives here and now using rich archetypal imagery and a language that is deceptively simple, a poetry distilled through the centuries and generations of storytellers. So I think that's a wonderful quote to try and encapsulate why fairy tales are so timeless, because some people say, oh, they're so old fashioned, or they're like, they're just like, they're so Disney-fied that all they really are maybe little girls who want to dress up in princess costumes. But really at heart, why they survived is because they do tell us deep psychological truths about ourselves and about the world around us. And I think that's why they still call to writers I mean, so many poets, short story writers, novelists. I mean, you know, you think about so many people so many writers have been influenced by them. Just off the top of my head, you know, Philip Pullman, J.K. Rowling, Marina Warner, Carol Ann Duffy. I mean, there's just so many writers that are inspired by fairy tales. So, I mean, I think that's why they keep cropping up throughout literature. But what we do now is obviously we can put a contemporary spin on them, or we can add to them what we think is relevant for our lives today and for our culture today. And that's what's really interesting, because we can bend them, we can reinvent them to however we want to tell our story through these timeless tales. So I'm going to kind of talk about how I see fairy tales as being. And I got, because I do art, I got my, I don't know if some of you are have one of these at home or remember one from art class. So basically it's just your regular, I suppose like a doll, like a figure for sketching in art class. So it's very basic. It just basically gives us the human contour. But what I think of as fairy tales is like they have this basic structure. So they have the head, and they've obviously got the heart within them, and they've got these moving parts and the limbs. But I mean, when we think about dolls, this is very, very basic. I mean, we can't even really tell if it's a man or a woman. So it's so basic, but we know what dolls are like. We can dress them up and change them in so many different ways that, let's say the basic heart of the fairy tale is this, and then, you know, you might end up with something like this. You know, it's basically the same: the head, the heart, the torso, some moving parts. And, you know, if this was a story, we would say, oh, maybe this is like a children's story. Oh, it's, you know, it's quite sweet, and it's maybe a bit twee. So that would kind of give us the flavor. Just by using these different attributes, we can see that our story is quite different now. And I've got some more dolls here for you. My daughter was really into these a while ago. So this is a completely different doll from like a series called Monster High. And obviously you can see she is very, very different. And, you know, that if that was a story, that would be very different from the doll story I've just shown you. And obviously, you know, the dress and the hair and the makeup is so different that would be a completely different story. And then going down to, I've got little Emmett here, if we know from the Lego movie. I love Emmett, he's great. And yet he's basically, it's the same, isn't it? We've got the head, the heart, we've got the moving limbs, but he's dressed very differently, and he's very modern, and it gives us a very different story. So again, so it's all these different stories that we can make out of this basic foundation. So it's really useful. It's lovely for us to play around with it. I mean, we can dress this doll in any kind of way we want to. We can decide whether it's, you know, we can decide what sex or gender they are. We could give them makeup, or we could give them hair, we could give them no hair, we could do virtually anything. But the heart of it, the foundation would stay the same. So that's rather like fairy tales. And so when I kind of think about fairy tales, there's a couple of things that I think we instinctively know that story is a fairy tale. And kind of when I think about like the heart, at heart, most fairy tales is basically about good overcoming evil. So at heart, good does triumph. Obviously, if you go to like all the original Grimm's tales, you find a lot of young people overcoming really difficult, hard situations, or battling with, you know, an evil stepmother or a sorcerer, or there's animals that have to overcome the wicked farmer or the bad man who's coming to try and get them. And so there is this idea that good will overcome evil. So I think at the heart, the fairy tales are teaching us that that's the way the world should be, or the way that they'd like the world to be, or the way that we'd all like the world to be. So at the heart, they've got this hope that good will overcome evil. Now, I kind of see the head as kind of the ideas or the problem or the situation that the fairy tale protagonist is thrown into. So it might be like every short story has an idea that they want to explore, such as, you know, trust your instincts. Bluebeard is a story that I keep coming back to, and I have written so much about Bluebeard. There's just something about the story that is amazing for me. But, you know, that is something about trusting your instincts, because a young wife is put into a situation where she is basically, her mother says, we think you should marry this older, rich man. And inside she says, I really don't want to. He is so not for me. I really don't trust that he's a good guy. And basically the story goes on to say, yeah, she should have trusted her instincts and said, nope, I'm not having anything to do with this chap. But of course, she ended up being put in a very, very difficult, horrific situation. So really, in many ways, the fairy tale is telling us, you know, be careful who you give yourself to, be careful who you trust. Because if there's your instinctual voice is telling you to be wary, listen to that. And yet society and culture often tells us, oh, no, be nice to everybody, be nice to that stranger, help that person, be nice to that girl, be nice to that boy, let's all be friends. And sometimes you can't be friends with someone. Sometimes you just don't like someone, or you don't get on, or there's a clash, or sometimes you are right to be wary of that person walking down the street. And so, you know, that instinctual voice is so important in our lives, and yet we often dampen it down, or told, oh, no, don't listen to your instincts. And I think mothers have that a lot. They're kind of like, obviously worried for the safety of their child, but they're like, okay, I don't think you should go there at that time with so-and-so, or I don't think you should be playing off down that area. You know, it's kind of like the mother instincts. And yet so often we're oh, they'll be fine. And then, you know, your kid falls out a tree and you're like, I knew it. So it's, again, it's like, there'll be an idea that the story wants to explore, like trust your instincts, or about, maybe it's an idea about finding your tribe. Who is your tribe? How can you find them? How many challenges do you have to overcome to find your tribe? You know, other things, if you kind of think about something like Sleeping Beauty, I mean, they didn't invite the bad witch, as it were, to the daughter's christening, and a whole series of stuff had to happen. You know, it was kind of exploring, well, what happens? Do we need to be generous to everyone? Do we need to invite everyone? Do we need to let the darkness into our lives? Can we control everything? Can we control our children? Can we make sure that they never come to any harm? So every story is almost like it has a head, like, what does it want to explore? And it's got the heart that hopefully good will triumph over evil. And then obviously the other things that the story have got is its moving parts, so its limbs, which is like, it's like the plot or the different characters. So the plot moves things along. First of all, we have like a setup. We've got a problem, you know, Red Riding Hood go through the forest, go through this, you know, maybe a bit scary environment, go and visit grandma. And then we've got a wolf there. So we've kind of got a setup and we've got a problem. Well, how's she going to solve this? What's going to happen? And we've got a lot of action fast. We've got, oh, there's a wolf. He's going to eat me. So it all happens very, very fast. And then we wrap it up very neatly with a conclusion that hopefully shows us how we should act in that, and that courage calls to courage. And that by trusting our instincts and relying on our tribe and calling to those who will help us in our hour of need, we will hopefully overcome the evil that has set out to unbalance us, and that evil could come from within, or it could come from without. So these are very movable, kind of the plot, you know, like what's going to happen when. We can do so much about changing them. I mean, if anyone's read the Grimm's Tales, you'll know that there's something like 7 edited versions of the book, and every time the Grimm's changed it very slightly, and you'll see the changes that they made. So they might have changed that bit of the plot, they might have cut that character. And so it just shows you how malleable it is. If you've still got the core, though, of the doll, the core of the story, it doesn't even matter if you make these tweaks to it. We will still understand what's happened and what's going on and what it's teaching us in our life. So people often talk about, sometimes I've heard people say, oh yeah, but the characters in fairy tales, they're just like so 2D, they're so stereotypical. I totally get that, and they're definitely drawn very lightly, very sketchily. But I would say that they're more like archetypes rather than stereotypes. And really, an archetype, it's the original model of all those other similar concepts that we're very aware of now. And I very much prescribe to the idea that Jungian psychology is very, very useful in our lives, and it can tell us so much. And it tells us so much through fairy tales. And according to Jung, an archetype is a universal pattern of thought that we basically see happening throughout the centuries. Humans act in these similar ways over and over and over again. So people might go, oh, it's very stereotypical, like, oh, the mother's always very loving, and there's a powerful sorcerer. But, you know, that loving, nurturing mother comes from a universal pattern of thought, in that we want someone to care for us. We have a connection with our mother, who is the very first person who we connect with. It's the very first relationship that we have in our lives. So it's really key to our development in emotionally, physically, psychologically. I mean, really, the womb in which we grew was our very first world. And so that's why it's an archetype. So they're very useful, and they're drawn very sketchily in fairy tales, so that we could go, well, we know what the mother's like. That's going to be a shorthand for she's a loving mother. And almost then we've got a shorthand for the stepmother. Well, she's going to be the evil one who's going to spoil things. But it's like they don't want to overcomplicate things. They want to draw things sketchily, so they know we'll recognize it. We know that wise old man is going to be a mentor figure. We know that he's going to have some great wisdom for us. And it keeps popping up over and over again. I mean, you know, we'll see it. I mean, I've got dozens of examples, but, you know, for me, it's always Yoda in Star Wars. Yoda is the wise old man. He's the mentor. And, you know, we immediately, like Yoda, we know he's wise. He's going to offer the young man, who is another archetype, the innocent young man, the innocent young woman, who are just beginning on their journey of what Jung would call individuation, which is becoming a whole adult being. And we know that Yoda is going to help Luke, and we can trust him, and he is very wise, and we should take that on board. So yeah, we see those characters drawn quite sketchily, but actually, in many ways, they're quite deep and they resonate with us. But what's interesting, of course, is in our contemporary day, today, we can do anything we want. We can swap their sexes, their genders, we can mess with them. We can turn Cinderella into somebody completely different. We can do anything we want that we want to explore, which is why they're so fun to write. And so, yeah, it's just so much fun exploring what they can teach us. So I don't know, has anyone here, just, you know, a brief show of hands, is anyone writing any fairy tales at the moment? Is anyone doing anything? Yeah, I can, great, that's great, got a couple of hands up there. Okay, so what I like to do is, if I don't know if anyone's heard of something called the mice quotient, M-I-C-E. So this was actually coined by an author called Orson Scott Card, probably, he's a science fiction writer. His most famous book was probably Ender's Game, but he was talking about writing, and I find this very useful. So MICE stands for, number one, M is milieu. So that is the environment or the setting in which the story is told. And then he talks about the idea. And so I is for idea, which is the information that the reader is meant to discover or learn during the story, like about trusting your instincts. We really want to explore that. What happens when you do and don't trust your instincts? So character is obviously all about the characters that you have, and they can change quite a lot, or they might not change, depending what kind of story it is. And then you've got E is the last bit of the MICE quotient, which is the events of the story. So that's the plot, that's what actually happens, and that's what moves things forwards. So the MICE quotient is really helpful. So we could see that something like where the milieu is very important, something like Alice in Wonderland would be a story that's very rich in milieu because it's so fantastical. It's about her exploring it, meeting all these amazing characters. And what he wanted to do really is for us to focus on this brilliant and amazing milieu. And he just basically takes us through it. Now, idea stories are, well, there's quite a lot of idea stories, and obviously every story does have a fair bit in it. But idea is like murder mysteries, or something like, well, who did it? Who done it? Who did the murder? And so we're drawn continually to answer these questions. Well, who did that? How did that happen? Did they get away with it? Did they not? Who actually is the murderer? So that's very much, a detective story would be, or a murder mystery, very much about that whole idea that drives us through reading the book. So character, when a story is very rich in C or character, that's quite literary fiction. And that's kind of in the main about the character and how they change, and all about their internal world and how that person tries to change their role in life. And then events are, I suppose, what people would call more like commercial stories, like, it'll be like the Count of Monte Cristo or the Lord of the Rings. One thing happens, the ring is lost and Frodo has to carry the ring, and it's bomb, bomb, bomb. Something happens. So there's disorder in the world, and the events must somehow put right the disorder in the world. So, people might say more genre fiction, more commercial fiction, but the events really drive us on through there. So, every kind of different genre has a different MICE quotient, but probably you'll see with fairy tales, we're not going to explore the character so much. Like we said, we're going to use archetypes. And so we're not really going to explore massively how the person changes, but the person will be changed. Like Red Riding Hood may not be so naive at the end. Certainly Bluebeard's wife is not naive by the end of it. But it's more in fairy tales. We're talking more about the events. We're talking more about the plot. We're going to concentrate on this happens and why those things happen. And of course, we've got our ideas. Like I said, that was almost like the head of the doll. We're going to explore something like, how do you trust your instincts? Should you not? But the milieu is really interesting, because the milieu is something that you can change just so much, because most of us will probably think of fairy tales and then we'll think of the Grimm's tales. So we'll immediately go to a Bavarian forest in those times, and we'll think of a maybe dark pine forest, and we'll think of people living in in quaint cottages and having fires and cauldrons, and quite basic, but that's immediately what we kind of think of when we think of fairy tales. But again, if you swap it, if we transpose the little match girl from her world to contemporary London, does that story still work? It completely can work. And in fact, I did publish a story like that in one of my anthologies, because at the heart, that story is going to teach us something very important. And that's about the little match girl and how she uses her last resources, really her last energy, on false hopes, when she should have used those matches in a more sort of in more purposeful way. But the point is that even though we think of the fairy tales as being set in those Bavarian forests and villages, we can set them anywhere we want to. We could go to the future. We could go to a dystopian alternate world. I've seen we've got Susie Hennessy here in the audience. Hi, Susie. Susie set a wonderful story in a completely different place that I'd never seen, and I don't want to actually give it away. You should just go and read the book and read Susie's story. But she set it in a fantastic place within a home, which really was amazing. But again, we can do anything we want to. We can set it in any part of history. We could set it in an alternate universe. We can set it on a completely different planet, or through like a magical portal door if we want to. So we can really have the milieu as anything that we want. And as long as we kind of keep those archetypal characters and think about, well, what idea do I want to explore? And what are the events that are going to help me explore that idea? Really, you've got a pretty good sketch and hopefully a good outline of how you could move forward with your short story, and make it something successful and something that would be published by anyone wanting to put together an anthology, or magazines, or you know, many publishers are interested, many of the small press publishers are interested in fairy tale retellings. So there are markets for them, and you should go for it if you are thinking of doing that. And, you know, look through the mice quotient, think to yourself if you kind of got the balance about right. And ultimately, you know, am I getting what I wanted to get across from what I'm writing? So I can see it's past, so I don't want to go on too much, but I did just want to mention that I have myself, I've written various fairy tale stories, and some of them I turn into science fiction pieces. And I've had quite a few published in this wonderful magazine called Shoreline of Infinity. So I can definitely tell you that they are a venue for short story writers who like to retell fairy tales in a science fiction setting. And I'm hoping to be working with Shoreline of Infinity in the future on maybe a future issue where I'll be taking submissions for it. So go and check them out now. And when we decide on open calls for submissions and stuff like that, I will be shouting about it. And I just really hope that I'll get some fantastic stuff. So yeah, so definitely go and check out Shoreline of Infinity. And if you are interested in any of these books, they're not, I think you can only find like secondhand copies nowadays floating around on Amazon, but obviously I've still got a few. So if anyone is interested in buying my pamphlet or one of these books, just message me or find me out in the on the online world, and you can just you know, message me via social media or find me on my website, which is teikamarija.com, and you can email me via there if you are interested in any of that. But I can see, I know that there's some questions in the chat. I haven't had a look, but I mean, if anyone has got a question now that they'd like to ask, I'd be very happy to answer it if there's anything. If not, I can just carry on talking forever, probably.
I was just wondering, you know, you mentioned the guy who set up the milieu and those sort of constructs. How were you spelling his name? Sorry, just so I can look him up.
Yeah, that's fine. Should I put that in the chat actually? I mean, it's not like you need to get it perfect. It's just, it gives you, when you're starting out on a short story, it gives you an idea of where is this short story going to go, because it kind of is really quite helpful to tether you, because if you start off and it's a murder mystery, but actually you get very interested in these two characters, and actually there's a romance going on and you're more excited about what's happening with them, then it's, you know, you haven't quite got your balance there, because actually what you're doing is you've gone off and explored the characters more than the murder mystery idea or whatever it was, the initial question. Do you see what I mean? So it's just quite useful to, you know, I mean, even now I work with writers who haven't quite got their milieu sorted, and I'll say, well, when is this set? And they'll sort of go, oh, I think it's 1920s or 1910. And I say, if you are setting that in a specific era and you're setting it in the real world, you have to be very careful about these things and say, well, you know, we had the First World War in that time. That's going to really affect characters. So is that something you're going to address? And then that really sometimes stops people, makes them think, oh yeah, I just kind of had this generic idea of the world is like this. But of course, you have to look at historical events and go, what's happening then? I mean, you know, I know some people who obviously will look back at a certain era and go, you know, there's been stories written about the hot summer of 1976. And so that's really useful. They draw on that time and the weather, and they incorporate that into their story. So that's really clever. And they're working with that to get their story right, if you see what I mean. So yeah, so always be very aware of what the milieu is.
Yeah.
Do I have a typical starting point, idea, milieu, existing fairy tale? Yeah, so that's a really good question. Sometimes I think it's something that we are really drawn to. I mean, like I said, for me, Bluebeard is a fairy tale that really resonates with me. I wrote an essay about it in a non-fiction book as well, actually, and I've written various short stories that feature Bluebeard, and I'm writing a novel that features Bluebeard. So yeah, he is very resonant for me. So it's sometimes there is something that will pique our interest. Like some people might just adore Cinderella. They'll go, oh, I love Cinderella, and they might feel themselves drawn to that particular story. So if you do have anything, an instinctual voice that's telling me, oh, I'm really drawn to that, I'm really drawn to whatever story, then that can be a really good springboard. And it's great, really, because it's a whole variety of ideas there for us at our disposal that can inspire us to write our own story. So if you do, like I do, if you have something instinctively going, oh, that's really, really interesting, I really like Bluebeard, I really want to write about it, but I'm going to twist it in various ways, then definitely go for that. You know, listen to the instinctual voice and that fairy tale drawing you. But if you're not quite sure where to start, I mean, I definitely recommend just picking up any collection of fairy tales, you know, taking the Grimm's tales, because there's so many of them. I mean, there's literally hundreds of them, and some of them are really short, and some of them are really quite long, but some of them are really obscure that we've hardly heard of, and they're really funny, and they're original, and they're entertaining, and you could be inspired by something that you've never read before, and then you could take that seed and go, oh, that's given me inspiration, I'm going to write this about that, but instead of a prince, it's going to be a princess, and instead of that, it's going to be a cat or something like that. My cat's inspiring me at the moment. But so do you see what I mean? There's so much material for us to use and reuse and recycle. So, you know, go back to the originals, you know, Hans Christian Andersen, the Grimm's fairy tales, Charles Perrault's fairy tales, Giambattista Basile, he's the Italian writer, the Russian writers as well. I mean, throughout every culture, there are fairy tales and folklore. And really, I mean, you know, something even on Wikipedia, if you want to explore fairy tales from completely different cultures, they're all on there. You know, for free. People are sharing these stories, so there might be, again, something about that story that just piques your interest. You're like, oh, that's really interesting, but I could transpose it to here, and I could do that, and I could do this. And so, yeah, it's huge amounts of inspiration, I think, that you can take the basics, like I said, with your doll here, and turn it into something completely different. So yeah, so that's what I do. But also what you could do is, you know, pick up a book like this, and then see what contemporary writers are doing, how they are revisiting those tales and making something new out of them, and then see what you think works and what you think doesn't work so much for you. And so, yeah, just reading widely. I mean, it's the usual sort of cry of the creative writing tutor, but it's true. I mean, reading widely really is critical. So, but so much inspiration. It's just like going down into, you know, going down mining, and there's diamonds everywhere, really. So I think Nicola's asking, I wrote a story called the Woman Who Swapped Their Baby for Salad, and was convinced that everyone would know the Rapunzel story, but quite a few people don't. So I think it's a comedy. So did you think it worked then? Were you happy with it?
Yeah, I was. I was very pleased with it. And I thought it worked, but I thought everyone would get it. But if they don't know the story, they're like, what? Why?
No, that's a great one. I really like Rapunzel. Like you said, what's happened with that one is very often in stories, they chop off that first bit, the bit with the, like you said, basically, the mother wants that lettuce, doesn't she, or whatever the vegetable is that the witch has, and so it's I think in some stories, is it the husband who goes and gets it for her, or she gets her herself? Yeah,
I think the husband gets it. Yeah, that's the one I know.
yeah, and that's wonderful, isn't it?
And I thought I'm giving away the whole plot, the ending straight away. And the story just builds up to that. And I've told you how it ends in the title. I thought it couldn't be more obvious what it is, but clearly people don't read fairy tales when they're little anymore.
Yeah. I mean, it is again, like I said, I think so many stories have chopped off that first bit, and all we've got is one day a wicked old witch took a baby away and imprisoned her in a tower. So it's a real shame that they've left that bit off, because I think that's actually the really interesting bit. So I think that's fantastic that you've been inspired by that. Like you said, if you are setting out to highlight the ridiculousness of that, I think, you know, you should be commended, because it's a very interesting concept, actually. And if you look at it, it's ridiculous. But again, at heart, it's quite dark, isn't it? Obviously, it's like, how much does she want this lettuce? She wants that lettuce a lot. And so what's the ultimate price going to be? I mean, that's a really dark tale, really. But again, like you said, that what you've done is you can make it lighter or darker as you wish. So you could dress that initial thing. So I mean, that sounds as though, to me, that's a successful story. So I keep going with that. So yeah, definitely. Sounds great. And then I've got Tracy asking, what are my thoughts regarding non-fiction, as in life imitating art? Yeah, again, that's just a really interesting question.
I just wonder, you know, because we're talking about fairy tales which belong to myth, which belong, like we say, to the archetypes, to the hero's journey, and real life stories where that's a possibility. You know, we are all living life, we are all faced with challenges in life, and sometimes you find yourself saying, God, this happened, you know, you wouldn't believe what happened. And you can recite this story from beginning to end, but it's actually real life. It's not made up. It's not, fiction. And it is life imitating art, imitating life. It's a bit of a rabbit hole, really, but
yeah. I think, again, it depends what kind of nonfiction you're writing, because, often in fiction we say, some fiction writers will go, but that really happened and I put it in my story. And editors say, no, it's too much. And you're like, that really happened. They're like, no, cut it, because the reader just won't buy it. And so sometimes you have to tone things down. Or change things. So that definitely happens a lot in fiction. But in non-fiction, again, you have to be obviously quite specific. That if you're writing, say, narrative non-fiction, which is almost like a memoir, or it's your internal story. If you see these things popping up that remind you of fairy tales, and they do keep cropping up, that you almost think, this is like it's out of a fairy tale story. I mean, it's like with anything, once you've written a manuscript, sometimes it's only by the finishing of it, when you reread it, you're like, oh my God, I didn't realize it's got that theme running through it. And then that happens, and then that echoes that. And you see these themes emerge. And that's a really special moment when you realize, well, hang on, I was just getting my characters from A to B to C. And actually what's happened is you've written something that's very, almost from your subconscious, that's very important to you. And it's kept cropping up, telling you, look at me, I'm important in your life. So once you see these themes cropping up repeatedly, you can almost make a feature of them and make sure that you weave them in a skillful way, and have them repeating, and make sure they're mentioned at various points. And, they're almost like the gemstones, throughout a, somebody once talked about, like, those kitchen worktops that you can get, which is like sort of like those granite ones, or those mixed, I don't know, it's like a mixture of like stone but other things, and sometimes you can get those shiny ones, and it's really, you can get those just little shiny stones within it, and it's like, that's the theme. It's almost like, oh, those little tiny things really bring a manuscript to life, when people realize, oh, there was those themes. And so you've got to work with them skillfully, but once you've recognized that them there, polish them and make sure they literally sing to us. And you can make a feature of them almost.
I tell you now, I think the main theme of mine is laundry.
Yeah.
I feel like something from a pantomime in Wishy-Washy, or that's just a bit of humor.
Yeah. No, but I mean that's true. When you, I think I said laundry is a good one, isn't it? I mean, I think loading the dishwasher seems to be my current theme. Continuously loading and unloading the dishwasher. But again, if you keep finding that happening, and you do sort of realize, oh, there's quite a lot to draw on that, like metaphors, and actually this is telling me quite a lot about my life, and this mirrors that and that and that, then you can almost make a feature of it when you recognize that. And then then it comes down to incorporating it in the real nitty-gritty of how you get into your prose. But then you could use ideas like, you think of yourself as a laundry woman, or you use terminology from washing machine manuals or whatever, or clothes labels of how to wash, and then you can literally use that kind of language, like adjectives and verbs or whatever, and the technical words, and you can drop them in here and there, and then the reader will be like, oh yeah, this is really, it's clever, but it's not you don't want to draw too much attention to yourself for being like clever, but again, people might not notice you dropping them in, and it gives so much richness to your manuscript. It's amazing, it really is. So yeah, when you find something like that, I would say to use it. see it as a gift and then use it in a constructive way.
Good answer, Teika. Thank you. And nothing goes to waste. Absolutely. Well, yeah, good answer.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Do you write for adults? Is there a market for adult fairy tales? Stories too dark for children? I mean, so yeah, this is a question from Debbie. Thanks for that again. That's an interesting question. I mean, definitely, Shoreline of Infinity, adults buy that. So, and these, these all the forgotten fantasticals, I called them modern fables and ancient tales. And hopefully the cover conveys that these are, I always called them dark fairy tales, and somewhere in the blurb it would be mentioned that they are, fairy tales for adults or dark. So yeah, basically all my fairy tales are for adults. I can see, I think, so you've been writing horror fairy tales. Yeah, Angela Carter's they are brutal. I mean, what happened, there's a very good book, actually by a writer that I worked with called Angela Topping, who analysed The Bloody Chamber and other stories. She's actually, so it's a whole like how-to student book, how to read it, and she sort of talks about the themes in it. And so, I mean, yeah, she says, actually, I think I might even have a quote here. I might not be able to find it though. I mean, she basically talks about how what happened was that over time, that fairy tales were always for children and adults. They were for everyone, because everyone would gather around the fire to share the folklore and the fairy tales, because they would teach us deep wisdoms about the darkness within and the darkness without. And you do need to teach children to be afraid of, the bears in the wood or the wolves in the wood, even though I don't think wolves are that bad, but the point is that there are dangers in the forest, and so everyone would gather around and these tales be told for everyone to learn from. But what happened was that kind of gradually, I suppose more like Victorian days, or like even the Grimms themselves, they started sanitizing and censoring their stories. And as Angela Topping explains, it was more that the fairy tales were then relegated to the nursery and they were sanitized. So they were like, oh, well, I don't know about these stories. I mean, you know what the Victorians were like, they very much wanted to sanitize everything. And so they're like, well, let's take out that bit where Cinderella's stepsisters actually chop off their toes in desperate bid for their shoes, for their feet to fit Cinderella's tiny little teeny glass slipper. I mean, that is really brutal. But again, that taught a very valuable lesson. Like some people will go to such lengths to hurt themselves to gain something of material value, or for status sake or whatever. That's a lesson. Some people actually do that. And so, the Grimms and the Victorians, they started taking these bits out. So, and then Disney comes along and, takes them and polishes them highly as well and makes them only for children. So really, dark fairy tales were for children and adults, but they kind of went along this path, and then the path split, and then someone like Angela Carter would write them again in the way that they were intended to be written, which were dark, and they were marketed as literary fairy tales for adults, and we love them. But yeah, most of us might be a bit concerned about reading them to our children still, because we still might have a sense that, I want to keep them safe. I don't want them to quite learn about the horrors just yet. But obviously in the past, different cultures, different generations felt very differently about passing on information from adult to children about the horrors of the world. So this is something that we now need to address. Are we going to keep these fairy tales sanitized, or do we let the children hear them in all their darkness? So, I mean, I know personally, I've been reading the original Grimm's fairy tales, the very first edition. And they are really dark to my children, and they've loved it. I mean, some of them, they've been like, oh, the poor XYZ animal who does just get it. Or, oh my God, he died and she died. Oh, it was horrible. But then other times, you know, if the baddie just gets, that's it, that's the end of the baddie, his head's chopped off, they're kind of like, yeah, the baddie got it. So, you know, I do think that they can cope if you talk to them about this stuff in context. But yeah, that's very true, that actually there's elements of horror in fairy tales, but where horror often diverges from fairy tales, and I think it's Clarissa Pinkola Estes from her wonderful book Women Who Run with the Wolves, who I would highly recommend, because that's got beautiful fairy tales and folklore in them, and she talks about the psyche of the wild woman and how these stories teach us about life and becoming a whole person. And in those, I mean, that's just a fantastic book. Sorry, I've lost my thread now. But so yeah, we're talking about the darkness, but you know, she's talking about also how we should address this, but it's up to us to put it into context and to decide, you know, whether we do want to have the horror in the fairy tale or whether we want to take it out. And then going down that path, I picked up my thread again, I think, a horror story, as Clarissa Pinkola Estes says, differs from a fairy tale very often, because the fairy tale will have the happy ending. So the horror story, very often, there's just no happy ending. You know what? The girl just dies at the end. The young man, he just dies in a satanic ritual. That's the end. And so the horror is about eliciting this emotion within us. But the fairy tales still want to have that at that heart. Remember, like I said, at the heart of them, and the heart of the little doll is saying, well, we hope that good will overcome evil. So that's why Cinderella does get the prince. That's why Red Riding Hood is saved. That's why Bluebeard's wife is saved. So that's where they that's where they diverge. I think that's the word. So I can see lots of things popping up in chat. So, a reading list. Yeah. A reading list would be great, wouldn't it? I think that's something I might do for a blog post or something. So yeah, okay, that'd be good. And I'll probably point you in direction for markets that are on the lookout for fairy tale retellings as well. So hopefully I'll do that. Just to address Debbie saying that hers are total horror. Well, I mean, there's so many horror markets that you would probably be best placed going there. But I mean, I've written as well horror that has got fairy tale tropes in it. So I can take bits from fairy tales, or I can take a character, or I can take a plot from the fairy tale, but I've very decided to put it in the horror genre. So that's another thing that we can do, just like some literary fiction writers will take the trope of something, some particular thing, but they will write a very highly literary fiction story around it. So yeah, you can do that, but your venues for publishing those stories are probably going to be slightly different to the venues that are specifically asking for fairy tales. But definitely, I mean, I think there are so many venues, just full stop, that I think everyone should be able to find a home for their short story fairy tale retelling. Yeah, I think Debbie's saying, and the Victorians made fairies like little girls instead of a true dark fairy. Yeah, they did. They made those little flower fairies, which is so sweet. But, you know, the fae were very much to be feared in many other folklore. They would steal your children away. I mean, what's delightful? What's delightful and, you know, sweet about that? There's nothing. So yeah, they were very dark, but the Victorians, like I said, and the Grimms themselves changed them. So bring back darkness. there is lots of it about, there's definitely lots of literature. So I will try to get a reading list to you. I will add that to my list of things to do. But that'd be great, because I could just add so much to it. I think it'll go on for a long time. Yeah.